Hello and thank you for joining our NetIQ webinar this morning. So we have John Wilkins here from Bytes and Chris Radband from NetIQ who will be going through the webinar with you.
Morning everyone. Okay, NetIQ are a strategic vendor for Bytes, introduced to our portfolio to assist in combating common issues we see within our AD customers and issues they have with AD management. NetIQ are very experienced at combating those issues, and that's why we're having this webinar. I know we had one on a similar subject last year, which was very well received. If you require any further information about how Bytes and NetIQ can help you and your organisation after the webinar, please contact your Bytes account manager. So I'll hand over to Chris Radband.
Okay, good morning. My name is Chris Radband. I'm a solutions consultant at NetIQ. I've been in the industry between domain admin roles, professional services roles, and pre-sales type roles for about 12 to 13 years now. So being a varied background, I've seen a lot of different things from a lot of different customers. So that's about me. But who have we got on the call today? So it's a very diverse audience, all sorts of job titles, and from all sorts of industries. Primarily, that's because the health of Active Directory and its maintenance is applicable obviously to all industries, and the challenges and potential solutions that we see are common across all sectors. So we're going to talk about 4 key areas today. These are challenges that I've seen personally, are common across the industry, but also because they're challenges, they're areas where solutions do exist. We'll look at those 4. So we'll look at challenges and the possible solutions. Firstly, around how to manage a mature and in reality generally cluttered Active Directory environment and how that can be cleaned up. We'll then move on to review some common challenges around things like compliance and things like audit. Then we'll begin to look at how we can move forwards with things like how we can proactively control these challenges, and also look at how we can hand some power back to the end user, to the manager, to the business owner, whatever that may be. Handing that power back to them rather than maintaining the effort levels required for the help desk to do so. The target really for the call is to look at how we can turn good practice into becoming standard practice. So first of all, we'll begin with how we can clean up the Active Directory. I generally see this as a beginning because in reality few people are lucky enough to have a greenfield site, so it's handy to be able to get things tidy before looking to move forwards, and to be able to get things tidy and to have the knowledge to be able to move forwards, it's important to understand what you currently have. Obviously you're continually dealing with operational challenges and changes, so the cleanup that you put in place needs to be realistic, it needs to be automated and practical, and potentially done in a staged fashion to enable that reality and practicality of the cleanup. From there, you can potentially have a good base from which to work upon, and ideally avoid the concept of if rubbish goes in, rubbish comes out. So clean up your estate first, and then we can move forwards. So generally when I show this slide in a room where I can actually see the attendees, it's a case where you get lots of nods and discussion and comments, because there are very few customers who can't claim that at least one of the challenges that they see on the screen right now is appropriate to them. In reality, most customers that I see have most of these issues. So if we just take a minute to take a look at some of the specific challenges you can see there. So what's the biggest risk? Well, obviously that's different for everyone. Environments are different, environments are unique. But from the list, the one that I see most frequently is around power users. And worryingly, the frequency with which those power user groups, so domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, anything along those lines, the frequency with which those groups are nested groups. So you'll find that, you know, not half a dozen people exist in domain admins, not even a dozen people, but there may be groups and groups and groups. So those nested groups can lead to 200, 300, 400 people in domain admins sometimes. Obviously, that's a significant security risk, and there is a recognised need to reduce the number of those domain admins by delegating the appropriate permissions. So that's the one big challenge we see. And you know, another common piece that I see there is around audit findings, for example. So the very common audit finding is along the lines of excessive inactive user accounts, because obviously those user accounts are enabled but inactive. Now, it may be the case that some people have a perception that even, you know, a traditional AD user account could be of little risk. However, bear in mind that user account may well be a member of a finance group or an HR group or a legal group. And whilst they've still got access because their account is active, as in not disabled, you know, there's no reason to say they couldn't physically log in and access that information, potentially share that information, and all that once again becomes a risk. The challenge there generally is because perhaps management, HR, whatever the case may be, aren't necessarily talking to the IT team to say this user's left the organisation, or even perhaps this user didn't join the organisation in the first place. So without that knowledge, IT aren't able to disable the account and to in effect secure that account. So as I say, whilst that account is enabled, there is an element of risk there. And thirdly, you know, what is a common bad practice that we see there? Well, sometimes that bad practice is due to laziness. For example, passwords set never to expire. So sometimes those passwords are, you know, there is a reason for them not expiring, for example, service accounts. However, there's commonly a lazy justification as well, whereby certain administrators perhaps don't want to change the passwords of their own accounts, but have the power to manage whether they need to be reset or not. Equally, for those accounts where it is appropriate to have a non-changing password, it's very straightforward, you know, to set that as password 1, for example, NetIQ 123, for example. However, you know, it's very important those passwords are particularly complex, wherever the reality of having a regularly changing password isn't appropriate. So food for thought there. But what it comes down to really, you know, just on that screen there are 10 or so common security risks, audit failures, performance impacts. All of those are bad practice, but very common practice indeed. So what a lot of customers say to us is, well, how do we manage that? And what I'll tend to do, first of all, is I'll flip that on its head and say, well, you know, currently, what do you do to manage those, you know, for example, those inactive users? So this is the answer that I generally get. So a script of some sort, generally PowerShell nowadays. So, you know, yes, a PowerShell script will work, but what we tend to see is that those PowerShell scripts will do 50, 60, maybe 70 or 80% of the job that you want to do. So for example, if it were a user creation task, it would perhaps create the account and enable it, but it wouldn't go away and set the correct required settings. Equally, a cleanup task may disable the user, so it may remove the original risk, however it won't necessarily manage groups, manage physical access to the building, manage mailbox permissions, anything along those lines. So the script that you're running potentially is, you know, isn't doing as much of the job as you need it to. So that standard solution of scripting produces risks because a number of challenges there. So whilst they're labour intensive to generate, the risk even more potentially is if the guy who's researched that script and written that script leaves the organisation, that script then potentially becomes unusable because the new guy that's replaced him doesn't know exactly what it's doing and potentially has, unexpected results because they don't understand it. So not only is it limited in what it does, but without an absolutely clear understanding, there's a potential risk there. An example of that, I saw a large civil engineering company who ran a script that they'd written theoretically to clean up inactive accounts, so accounts that were able to log in but hadn't logged on in the last 60 days. And what they discovered, unfortunately, after running that script, was that they'd pretty much emptied their domain admin's group. So that script, obviously significant unexpected results, and getting those users back into the domain admin's group when they'd already removed the user that they would normally access the domain admin's group with proved very difficult. So significant risk. But whilst I see the customers using these homegrown scripts, these scripts that have come from Google or whatever, consider it an automated process. Consider that automated process that's built around your specific requirements and defined by your stakeholders. So it's not necessarily wizard-driven whereby you're limited to 3 or 4 options, but it's designed by yourselves and in many respects commonly designed from an input of your current runbook perhaps. So the runbook may say, run a manual script to look at whether a user account has logged in recently, and you may say that as your organisation, that definition of recently is perhaps 30 days. So we would say that in that process, 30 days is what we define. So building that around yourselves, and we may also say that perhaps the approver or the owner of users or changes may be IT, maybe the help desk. However, possibly more appropriately, it would be the manager of the user in question, or it might be HR, it may even be audit. But we allow you to define in a very straightforward fashion, who is an approver, who is an owner. So at any point during a workflow process, you can define any level of approval you want. It may be multiple approval, it may be different approvers based upon what the output of the in this case, the cleanup task says. But however you look at it, there is definitely a better world which includes automation. So out-of-the-box functionality, but without the risks and challenges and unknown outcomes of those scripts we looked at on the previous slide. So consider that in the automated workflow world, you have things like, it's fully tested and therefore supported. It's fully testable before putting it into production. Full workflow, as you can see, things like ITIL methodology, reproducible, so you can run the same task over and over again with change control in place. And obviously, those workflows are customizable and, as I said, testable. So rather than unleashing an unrecognized workflow on your environment, you test that beforehand. You do modular changes, check in, check out, and then obviously they are, as we touched on, they're designed to fit around your specific requirements, exactly to your requirements to the organisation. So we can look at where we've come from already in a couple of slides. So we've come from an unmanaged and risky script-based approach, which covers 50–60% of the environment, to a safe and reliable, automated process. There is undoubtedly a better way. So if we begin to look in detail at this process, for example, we can see that generally the processes, however they're built, they will fall into 3 kind of key areas. So the first of which will be discovery, and we can see in that discovery process that the first thing is to determine, in this case, which accounts are inactive. And like I said, that's based upon your definition of inactive. So 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever the case may be. Once we've defined those, we can then begin to look at an action. So in this case, in a traditional world and running that script, it may just say, here's an output file, CSV file, for example, of username and when they last logged in. So then it becomes a manual process for the organisation to manage that. However, with this automation cycle, you then have an action, and what it's saying is, ask the administrator, ask the manager, ask the HR, whoever it may be, we've recognised that this account that you own is inactive, so what do you want to do about it? And then we can see a third step, for example, remediation, and you can see that the account is disabled, but only subject to the approval of that manager. So you don't have the risk whereby accounts are accidentally disabled. You also may have that the manager, the owner, whoever it may be, takes the opportunity to have a number of different options. So it may be the case that the account is inactive because the user's on holiday. It may be because they're on maternity leave. Maybe they've left the organisation. So any number of those options that you choose to define during the approval stage may well mean that different outcomes exist, from just a user being disabled to a user actually never having joined the organisation and their account being deleted. Equally, if they've left the organisation, it may be that not only is their account disabled, but their access is delegated to their manager, perhaps to give access to their mailbox, and perhaps something like their physical building access is revoked as well, and even requests to get their payroll stopped, to get their hardware back, anything that's required around that user's process. So that would become almost a deprovisioning process, which also can run on its own for the benefit of HR to run, managers to run, so that it's run in real time when the user leaves. Within a couple of minutes, their account, their access, anything they had permission to, potentially is secured. So once we've looked at cleaning up, we can then begin to consider the current challenges. So things that we see that that I believe are common across the environment. We'll look at what those challenges are and how we can work to ensure that they don't bring the environment back into a poor state after you put the effort in to clean it up. So we'll look at a couple of common examples, a couple that I've seen recently, and in this case they're around audit and compliance and also around group policy management. So we can consider, in the case of audit and compliance, that there are many standards. You can see lots on the screen there, and generally they are around good practice. So if you look at ISO 27001, PCI, SOX, and many other regulatory frameworks, they all dictate processes and procedures that should be in place, generally around controlling, monitoring, and reporting upon security and the activities within the organisation. So if we take one standard, for example, and look at ISO 27001, it says that care should be taken that no single user or person has access to modify assets without authorization or detection. So what that says to me is approval and auditing to ensure that that is complete. But natively what we tend to see is that that's very, very difficult at best to be able to achieve. So consider that trawling through event logs, it simply isn't realistic. It's time consuming at best. The logs roll over much more frequently than the human eye can generally read them. And let's consider that even if you do have the time and effort and inclination to be reviewing those logs, how do you look at reporting on those? How do you ensure that a manual process where it is fraught with issues like event logs rolling over, how do you ensure that that is sufficient for a compliance mandate? And obviously, ease of use simply doesn't come into the game because it's not realistic to be making those changes. So what we need to consider is that in reality there needs to be a proactive and immediate response to certain changes that occur, because if you discover a week later that a change has occurred, perhaps to an important group, to access, to anything critical to the Active Directory, a week later the directory may have fallen apart in many respects. The user may have made the changes they want to make. Event logs will have rolled over, so it becomes very difficult to manage any changes that are critical if you're not discovering them, in effect in real time. The reality of that is that something like SOX, if you're not monitoring those changes, potentially someone ends up going to jail. So if we consider what customers look for, in an audit solution, first and foremost, in reality, is to put ticks in boxes. So, from a regulatory and compliance perspective, that is why a customer will buy an auditing solution. However, once in a while, you see customers that also that primarily buy an audit solution for good practice. It allows them to see what's actually happening in their Active Directory, but generally, that good practice perspective is a side benefit to the reality of requiring a solution for compliance benefit. But since we're talking about best practice and making that into standard practice, we also need to consider the reality of having real-time alerting. We've mentioned that it's very important based upon specific changes where that weekly report, that manual report, simply isn't realistic. An example I saw a year or so ago was working for a large oil company, multi-million turnover obviously, and what they discovered literally minutes after implementing an auditing solution like this was that one of their help desk guys, who was a domain admin, commonly in organisations I see that even if a help desk guy is supposed to be doing nothing more than resetting passwords and a bit of group membership, commonly I'll see that those users are domain admins, and this was the case even in organisation size of these. And what they were doing was every night that domain admin was adding his colleague to the domain admin's group simply so that his colleague could watch YouTube on the night shift. Now, obviously YouTube, against the rules, inappropriate. However, the bigger risk obviously being that that user could very easily perform any changes that he likes overnight. Very, very risky obviously. So, given that situation, consider the opportunity cost, of not having a proactive solution for auditing and monitoring in place. Potential failed audit, negative media coverage, potential downtime even. So that's an example of where that proactive management is necessary. Another example that I saw recently was at an insurance company, and when their users came in on a Monday morning, the screen that you can see now was all that they saw. What happened was that they'd rolled out a new group policy over the weekend, early on a Monday morning, and the purpose of that was to roll out a new shortcut to the desktop. However, as you can see, all it actually did was remove all the shortcuts and the taskbar from the desktop. So they had no group policy backup, they had no rollback available, and they didn't actually know, what had caused the specific issue. However, within an hour or so, they'd done sufficient troubleshooting and they'd updated the group policy. So it took them an hour or so to make that change, to hopefully back out the wrong setting they put in, and then it took another hour or so for that change to propagate, for the users to restart the machines, and to be able to begin work for the day. So we can look at, I think there are about 1,500 users, and in reality, between modifying the group policy and then getting it rolled out to the users again, they were talking about 2 hours downtime per user on a Monday morning. So for every user, they were unable to service customers at 1,500 users, 2 hours on Monday morning. That's a lot of lost downtime potentially. So they then came to us and they said, what can we do? We recognise that our group policy practice isn't working. Unfortunately, they've learnt the hard way. But they came to us and they were requesting 4 key areas. They were looking for version control of their group policy, notification and alerting around changes to the group policy, and also ideally the ability to roll back changes that had been made to the group policy. So we proposed to them a complete automated solution, and on top of those 4 key requirements they've given us, we added the ability to manage unmanaged group policy changes as well. So whilst certain group policy changes are expected, it doesn't mean to say that certain changes couldn't be made using native tools, for example, on the back end, where those changes, we obviously don't want them to go amiss either. But however the change is made, we offered that functionality. And we can look at the process that we put in place. We saw earlier that there are commonly 3 common steps to a process. So number 1 is what you see at the beginning of this process. It's a discovery and identification step. So that's recognizing the change. In this case, it's the kicking off, so to speak, of an unmanaged group policy change. And then we can see on this slide the fact that that change has been made. But what we've got here is we've got the ability through a report or a number of reports and an email sent to IT managers, owners of the group policy, whatever you choose to define, saying, is this change appropriate? And as you can see, it's giving you the change report to see what's occurred, the differences between the versions, but also it's giving you in that email, it's giving the opportunity to remediate the change. So you may want to either implement the change, or importantly, you have the ability to roll back the change. Very simply, as you can see, all you have to do, it says if you want to roll back, reply to this email with the word rollback. So the manager is given all the information appropriate to that change, and literally with a response to a single email, they can roll back that change if necessary. So very straightforward. You do it on a BlackBerry, you do it on a smartphone, you don't need to be in front of your laptop. So that email showing all the required content allows immediate rollback if required. So this real-time and proactive management, it doesn't only adhere to good policy, to good practice, but it also minimises the risk on the organisation. Things like lost revenue, those occurring, as we just saw, 3,000 hours worth of inactive users unable to manage user accounts and customer accounts. A process like this will help you to avoid that. So they have learnt the hard way. However, what we can see is that a process around that can help to enable the management of that moving forwards. So we've looked at both the cleanup and common challenges that we see, but let's move forward now and let's look at how we can regain control over the directory and start to ensure that that good practice that we've been talking about, and let's make sure that that becomes standard practice. So having looked at auditing and alerting, we can consider being more proactive with a delegation model. So we can start to say that the help desk guys who are currently domain admins have far more rights than are appropriate to their role. Now, natively, that's very difficult to securely and granularly manage those permissions, and it's near impossible to report upon those permissions. And natively, every user, every user in the organisation, even if they're a traditional user and nothing more than that, they have read permissions over the directory. So consider how great it would be if you could take those challenges away, implement a role-based model, in which case certain, which allows you to manage the who, the what, and the where, and giving the added value of complete auditing around around any changes that are made. So, in the example of the help desk, The who is the help desk potentially. The what is, well actually those users should be able to reset some passwords, perhaps allow them to generate basic user accounts, and group membership. So if we consider the example of domain admins, that's far too much permissions for them, but we can say, using the what functionality, we can say, well actually they just get basic help desk functionality to do what they need to. So that's where a delegation model starts to build, and then we can say the where. So in an organisation which is managed geographically, you may well want to see that London users are managed by the London IT guy, and that users in Bristol are also potentially managed by a Bristol guy, and that they're separate. You may want to use things like automation so that actually overnight either user can manage the London or Bristol users. Equally, you may want to say that if you're just a help desk user, you can manage all users, but you can't manage administrative users, you can't manage servers, that kind of organisation. So you can define not only what permissions they have, but who they are and where in the directory they can manage. So I've seen customers do obviously delegation for good practice, but lots of different reasons. So for example, you may want to delegate that a team leader in the business rather than in IT has permission to manage perhaps the passwords of their team, or perhaps group membership that is owned by themselves. So they may say that in a branch office, the manager can recognize his team and can reset the password, unlock the account, so IT don't have to worry about it. However, that manager is responsible and can make the changes very quickly. Equally, a business owner may well be in a much better position to manage the membership of his groups than an IT guy, because it's the manager and the owner of that information and that group membership that knows who should and who shouldn't be in that group. So it begins to reduce current security challenges whilst improving the delegation model and security around that. So once we have that basic model of delegation, giving people the right permissions, the right views, we can then start to look at moving further in the right direction. How do we want to automate access, for example? So we may want to say that giving the power back to the managers or the departmental admins and reducing the load on the IT, obviously it's a cost saving, but also it's a business improvement potentially. And what you can see here, we can look at an example of temporary administrative group membership. So that's going to be used potentially around specific projects or around specific change controls. Similar processes can be defined for all sorts of things, user provisioning, for example, giving that access and that management back to HR, back to the owner, but importantly, the owner of the user and the object, rather than requiring IT to make the change, which commonly is slow, can be error-prone, is very paper-based, and obviously has a cost associated because it's a headcount that's making that change. Commonly, I see organisations where it can be upwards of 5 days to provision a user, and commonly also I see organisations whereby it's not mentioned until the Monday morning that the user arrives on site that they're even beginning. So HR may know that if IT don't, and it takes IT 5 hours to provision an account, there's obviously downtime there for the user, so there's a risk. However, in this example where we're considering automated access and access approval, we'll consider users or managers defining around their own processes who should have access. So, for example, let's take a look here, and we can see the first step is for a user, possibly, or a manager on their behalf to request access via, in this case, a web form. It could equally come in from an intranet form or, a predefined, formatted email request. We can then see that the process begins to move along. The process begins to look at who would be the appropriate approver for access like this, and then starts to say, well, actually, can you approve this for me? That owner would then approve the access, or in effect deny the process. And as you can see, in the case where a deny takes place, generally it would be logged, an email would go back to the requester explaining why there had been a denial of approval. But then, assuming the approval takes place, we can see that at the requested time for the change to begin, the user is added to the group. So by waiting until the time of the required access, you're ensuring the user doesn't have those elevated permissions for longer than appropriate. So they may request on a Monday morning, however the appropriate access may not be until Friday afternoon if the change is going to take place over the weekend. There's no point in having that user in a risky position, for example, in that elevated group until they need it. So come the time of the change, the user is added to the group, and then potentially, and more importantly to some extent, at the end of that change window, the user may be removed from the group. It's very common that a user will be very vocal when they want to be added to a group. However, when they've made the change, they very rarely notify IT or whoever it may be that they no longer need to be in that group. So that becomes a risk, because if that user remains in something like a domain admins group, obviously they have those permissions. Generally, you would hope it's not a problem. However, it's very common, this is how domain admins groups, for example, become full again. So it may be the case that before that user is removed from the group, you may like to say, give them a notification to say you're going to be removed from this group in an hour, gives them the opportunity to have their manager approve extended access, for example. But it's very important to at least schedule removal from membership of the group as appropriate, based upon your specific workflow requirements. So that's an example of a very common requirement we have around temporary group membership. I've seen a number of customers buy a product specifically just to get that temporary access requirement solved. Other common requirements we see are around user provisioning. It's a common one that users, that organisations have a user provisioning process defined. However, as we touched on, whilst it's defined, it generally is the case that it's not sufficient for more than 50–60% of the organisation's requirements. What we tend to see customers having missed out in their definition is something like a deprovisioning process. It's very commonly overlooked, as I say, and as we discussed, inactive but enabled common user accounts are a significant risk. Obviously, it's a potential audit finding, but if we consider that it's something like 40–50% of organisations that experience security breaches commonly blame the accounts that are associated with ex-employees. So there is potential not only to disable those accounts and secure them, but also to complete a more significant deprovisioning process. So common to want to move an account, to rename the account, to remove access, obviously, but also to do things like delegate the access to the mailbox, to the home folder, and potentially manage physical things, so manage physical access to the building, and take control back of their physical assets, so perhaps laptops, PCs, anything that may be required. All of those obviously are auditable, tracked, and automated processes, and we can see they fit around your corporate requirements and their policies. Also, it's reducing the help desk load and also helping you to achieve those audit requirements. So the fourth step that I tend to see, we've looked at cleanup, we've looked at common challenges, and we've looked at turning the good practice into becoming what is standard practice for you. And we've started to touch on giving users the ability to request advanced permissions on a temporary basis, for example. But let's look at further how we can empower the user and take away potential things like password management tasks from the help desk. Obviously, they tend to be frequent requests for password management, and it's obviously something that you can very easily generally put a cost on per change from an administrative perspective, but also, if you discover that it's taking an hour from a user discovering their account is, they've locked themselves out, for example, to being able to work again, obviously there's an impact on that timing as well. So if we look at a few statistics, consider them and how scary some of those can be. 2/3 of end users write their passwords down. Equally, 2/3 of users use the same password for multiple accounts. 4 out of 5 customers admit to have forgotten their password, and 3/4 of intrusions are expected to exploit weak or stolen credentials. So those weak credentials that are generally shared, they're generally written down, that are commonly forgotten, are a significant risk. So instead, we should consider providing the user the ability to reset their passwords from any time, from any place, potentially by things like challenge response questions. It's not an uncommon statistic for 50 to 60, 75 even % of help desk calls to be password related. It's not a new problem, but it does have a solution. It's something I see frequently, talk to lots of customers about it, and it's a great quick win from a perspective of ROI. Customers, as I say, can calculate very easily what those costs are per password reset requirement, and they can illustrate and provide a quick ROI to the business for implementing those changes. So you are empowering the user. Further to empowering the user's basic requirements of things like password management, you can start to empower them with further processes. Things like temporary access requests that we've already talked about, things like new computers, and we also touched on the ability to allow a manager, for example, to request a new user account for a new team member that he's got joining. So they're just examples of further self-service requests, further improvements on help desk efficiency, because all that they or their managers or owners have to do is approve the request, perhaps check it over, but they're not spending their days copying and pasting from a request form or rewriting from a handwritten manual request form into Active Directory using computers or any other process to start to define that. So once again, improved ROI from the time and efficiency, but also the data quality, the audit, the approval side of things. So we've talked about examples of group membership and delegation of basic account changes, perhaps in branch, allowing managers, branch managers for example, to access and to manage some of their users' basic information. As I say, efficient and reducing the costs. So just to touch on very quickly some of the products that I've talked about today, primarily driven by our Active Directory management solution and automation solution, so Directory and Resource Administrator, the Advanced Edition. We also looked at things though like group policy management, Active Directory auditing, and things like self-service, password resets, enabling. So those would be the third, fourth, and fifth solution you can see there around Group Policy Administrator, Change Guardian for Active Directory, and also self-service password reset. Does what it says on the tin, really. So what I want to switch now is I'm just going to switch over to show you a very quick demonstration of one of the processes that we looked at just now. So that process was around the temporary group membership. So what you can see here is the console from which the process is run. Now, bear in mind, you don't have to run a process from here. What you more likely would do is you'd run it from you would run it from a website, built into your intranet. You may trigger it from an email, anything along those lines. So we can make those changes very easily. But on the back end, this is the kind of process that you would begin to see running. So obviously, you would have a process in place, and we may say that on Friday, I want to have access to group B1 for a predefined period of time. In this case, 120 minutes. You can modify that to your heart's content. And as I say, this may come in from an email, more likely, or a web form. However, we can see that on the back end, we can see the process is going through, and it's starting to find the Active Directory objects that are requesting access, that it's looking at the groups that we require access to, and then what it's going to move on to, as you can see on the top right there, where it says email group owner, that is sending off an email to, in this case, the group owner. It could be anyone that you define, whether that be IT, as we've discussed, and then it's waiting and looking for a response from that owner. Once it receives a response from that owner, it will define whether it's an approved change or whether it's a denied change. It may even be that no response comes, and that there's a third option there whereby the approval goes to another manager or is resent to the same manager to try and get the approval. Once that moves through, we'll be able to see that the member would be added to the group, assuming that approval has been successful, and then we would see that whilst we wait for the predefined, in this case 120 minutes of change window, then the user is removed again. Very, very simple example of what's going on. However, it illustrates very well the kind of challenge that a lot of customers see, and the kind of solution template that we would generally base further workflow upon, and based upon your specific customer requirements. But from my perspective, that's what I wanted to show you in the demo. So what we'll do now is we'll hand back to the organisers for any questions and answers that you may have. But I hope that's been a useful session for you.
Okay, so we have a question here. So it says, any plans to include mobile apps for Active Directory admins as part of the product?
So the current administration is all via Webb, and potentially approvals via email. So there's no reason that you couldn't currently do it if the tablet that you were using were able to access it. However, we are potentially able to publish something like the administration console via our mobile access solution, which would allow the users either via phone or via tablet on iOS or Android to be able to administer some of the configuration, but more likely to be able to approve and make changes. Natively, no specific apps. However, there's no reason we couldn't make the interfaces available moving forwards. Okay,
thank you, Chris. Okay, so it appears we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much, Chris, for today, for going through the webinar, and everyone, thank you for joining us on this webinar today.